Okay, are we good to start now? Or?
Yeah, we are live now, so I'll just start the debate. So welcome everyone to round 2 of the New Zealand Schools Debating Competition. If we can get the first affirming speaker from Wellington Black, Julia, to start the debate.
Sports can act as an invisible line, drawing arbitrary divisions between people. The national identity of our country should be a statement of who we are as a community and not an impartial game. What do I want to prove in this debate? Either that sports are as an integral facet of our identity is hurting our society, or secondly, that alternative sources of national pride are better in terms of our economy and our society. So with that in mind, 2 points that I'll be bringing you today. Firstly, the harms of having sport as part of our national identity, and secondly, what the comparative would be and why that is preferable. And here we'll be talking about a moral obligation to make this switch. So firstly, a bit of setup. So what do we see our national identity as? We say that is a set of values for a country that their ideas are based around things that they pay a lot of attention to. For example, America has this national identity of freedom, and therefore people put rights before everything else, often to bad effect. Okay, so what do we think sport sets as these values for New Zealand when we have it as this cultural identity? We say that it sets ideas about competition. We say it sets an ideas of tribalism. We say it sets ideas of nationalism, and that is why we think it is harmful. So what do we prefer instead? We would say national identity based around environmental care and Indigenous, so we say Māori issues and culture. So we say also that if people focus more on sport, then they have less space in their heads to focus on other issues. So we can't just simply have all of these as part of our national identity. We say there's only so much space in this national psyche to care about different issues. So we do have to make this trade-off between sports and what I'm proposing on the F, which is environmental care and Māori culture. And this is obviously going to be preferable, as I'll be proving throughout my speech. So on to my first point about the harms of glorifying sport through national identity. So we want to prove that it is overall detrimental to our society to be having this in place. So we say firstly that for some context, people take sports extremely seriously in this country because it is part of their national identity. When they win, lose, they have their whole moods shifted by this, often for months. We say it's not just a sport, as some might say. It is very much internalized within fans' views of the way they see the world and their emotional responses. Okay, so we say that there are a lot of impacts of sport carrying these implicit messages of competition, tribalism, nationalism. We say, firstly, it has this big impact on domestic abuse in New Zealand, because when people, these people care about sport, and when they lose, they are completely devastated. They've been drinking at the games, they're drinking at the pubs afterwards. They come home with this bad, feeling angry at having lost the game. They come home drunk and they take this anger out on their families. New Zealand has a domestic abuse epidemic, and having sports as our cultural identity only exacerbates this. Because people care so deeply about it that they start integrating it into their everyday lives, and they start taking out their anger on it on people in their lives, which we think is abhorrent. Secondly, what does having sports as a national identity do? We say it makes people hate other countries. We say it's not they're oh, we lost to England, now I hate England, I don't want to do a trade deal with England. No, we say it's more of an implicit internalizing this messaging that other countries are foes, not people to work with. They treat the world as a zero-sum game where only we can win, only they can lose. So they see other countries as foes, not people to work with, not people to form international organizations with. Okay, so there's no political will for internationalism, etc. And we think, setting up borders in this time of international peril with climate change and take action on that is absolutely the wrong direction to take things in. We also say we see a lot of tribalism. Thirdly, in different countries, parts of New Zealand, different teams interacting, there's no recognition of other people's views because I am right, I am the best team, they suck. Okay. We also say there's this precedent for following authority, because people support the All Blacks no matter what, right? You get shot down if you're around and you say, oh, I like the Springboks better, and all the Kiwis will come at you and say, what are you doing here? So this sets this precedent for people to say, okay, I support my country, whatever they're doing, I support my team, whatever they're doing. And so they start accepting whatever the government wants to be doing without like questioning it, which we think is not helpful towards government scrutiny. And finally, we say like influential sports people, when people care so like have such a great care for sport because it's an integral part of national identity, then they'll listen to sports people no matter what. And we think it better, like, so they can therefore broadcast their harmful views upon society, have them taken in because these sports people are so idolized. For example, Israel Folau being completely homophobic and people thinking, oh, this is okay, it's coming from a sports person, and people just accepting that because it's coming from a large influencer. Okay, so what are the impacts here? Firstly, of course, the like tangible harm of abuse on society when these people who care about sports come home drunk, they beat their family. We also see no will for internationalism, which is completely harmful in the current social climate. We also see no government scrutiny. We also see like just all these massive harms on society when sport is so glorified because it is part of the national identity. We say, I mean, yes, that might exist either way, but it is so much exacerbated by it being a massive part of the identity, and we think getting rid of it will reduce those harms greatly. I'll take a point of that information now.
When sport is so prominent in the national identity, it puts these idols in the public spotlight and increases social accountability. Is it not important to hold our athletes to these high standards when it is so spread throughout New Zealand?
Well, we think like there's no chance for them to broadcast the unsavory views upon the population if they're not idolized in the first place. We would rather that they don't give these views out and show these influences upon the population than just a band-aid over the wound, be like, oh, some scrutiny, because the real thing is the sports fans don't really care about the liberals going on about how bad they are. They just be like, oh, yeah, anyway. So on to my second point about the comparative sources of national pride and why they are preferable. So we think, as I've said, limited number of things that can be in the national conscience. So we have this trade-off between sports or our alternative, which is environmentalism and focus on Indigenous issues. So we say, what is the world going to look like, firstly, if we have an emphasis on the environment as a cultural value? We say people care more about the environment, and it is exclusive to like New Zealand because we already have this we have a beautiful environment. We have so much to gain by protecting it and making that part of our image. And it's good for tourism, as I was talking about my impacts. Okay, so firstly, it's something that people can pitch into, right? They can all be like, be a tidy Kiwi, be helping out the environment, as opposed to sport where they're just sitting back on their couches watching some Kiwis go in. So it's a much more, like, it's good for rallying the nation on something that they can actually tangibly put impacts to. We say they're also less likely to trash the environment, more likely to care about it, which is something we implicitly want, because a better environment means better health altogether for New Zealanders. But we say, like, no one dreams of trashing the All Blacks, so having this in place will stop people from being trashing the environment. People also care more about the environment, they vote for it, and it also becomes like a pan-partisan issue because it is part of the national identity. So we're always going to be guaranteed to get environmental action from these parties. Also, what happens if we get Indigenous issues in the cultural spotlight? It becomes a source of national pride, which means that we start getting people learning the language, learning the culture. For example, in Ireland, they have a great impetus on the Indigenous culture. Everyone knows Gaelic in Ireland, which means cultural understanding. We think that's what we want to repeat in New Zealand. So we also get a more awareness of issues facing Māori, which means people holding the government more accountable to taking action on those issues. Okay, so this means that Indigenous people's culture is acknowledged and not tokenized like we see currently with the haka, which is like only relatable to a small like North Island iwi, not to the whole country, but that's ignored because it's just like a tokenistic thing. Okay, and we get Māori representation on their own terms instead of like the colonizers' terms. And for environment, we get more climate action, we get more unity because we don't put this impetus on division through sport. We get a good economy through tourism because we promote a clean national image. So we are proud to stand like put our identity on the base of who we are and not what we play.
I thank the speaker for their speech. I'd now like to invite up the first negative speaker from Waikato, Travis.
Okay. When a 10-year-old kid sees his favorite All Black player win the World Cup on the international stage, he thinks anything is possible, even for the small island nation of New Zealand. He thinks that he understands the value of endurance, of respecting your teammates, of strong leadership. He understands that a sporting national identity positively shapes the next generation to be inclusive and physically active. We support the continued prominence of sport in New Zealand culture and looking to establish things like local sporting clubs and charities, encouraging physical activity in youth, embracing national teams like the All Whites or the All Blacks in all sporting codes, and supporting this booming industry. Our burden today is to prove that when sport is an integral part of New Zealand's national identity, it has a positive influence on the New Zealand people, and removing it harms cultural positions in New Zealand. We bring you 3 points today. Firstly, what does the current national identity look like? Secondly, what is the impact on sports fans? And thirdly, a split point about this, how will this increase social inclusion? But I'd like to move on to some rebuttal. The opposing team said that these shifts in moods are going to last for months. We reject this premise. We think that the country usually isn't that sad for a couple months. It's usually maybe a week. And also if they have such anger and such emotional issues, isn't it it's actually a much better way to have an outlet for these emotional issues, and they can work through this on the sports field in a safe way that doesn't harm anyone else. Thirdly, we think that it's not going to threaten international deals over a sport. The country will still continue trading with Britain and still doing these economically positive things. We don't think that will occur. There was also no explanation of what tribalism actually means or why it's harmful. We don't think that New Zealand's going to go back to the Stone Ages where there's divides in our society. We don't think that was ever fleshed out by the opposing team. We also say that when idolization is part of when these idols in sport are part of the national identity, they're going to be seen in the public spotlight, and so they're going to have more social accountability. There was a massive social backlash to Israel Folau, so you can still create these social pressures. The rest of my rebuttal will be integrated. So firstly, how do we what is the current national identity in New Zealand? We tell you that New Zealand is a small island nation with lower economic influence and global power situated on the fringe of the world. However, we want New Zealand's national identity to be a way for New Zealand to express its culture on the global stage and prove that we are stronger than we seem. We think that the sport, it proves that New Zealand can punch above our weight and be identifiable in the international community, and it's uniquely suited to give New Zealand a chance to prove ourselves, and we should embrace it and its current prominence in our culture. Firstly, sport allows us to win international competitions throughout the entire world. New Zealand consistently performs well in the Olympics, getting the highest medals per capita, and we are the most feared and respected rugby team in the world. This proves that we can still compete against world superpowers like the USA or Britain and beat them. By rejecting sport, you return to a world where New Zealand is only a fringe island nation, and there's no ability for them to do so. Secondly, we said that sporting cultures forms the development of these top athletes. When children look up to these players at a very young age and they embrace this identity at a very young age, they'll be honing their skills and practicing drop goals in their backyard at the age of 10, and therefore they're going to be more skilled when they grow up. And this passion for sport is a prominent reason why we are so competitive on the international stage and why people pursue a career in sport. Thirdly, we think that New Zealand culture is about ingenuity and determination, right? New Zealand first developed its reputation during World War I and World War II, showing that our fighting soldiers were stronger than other nations and they had the perseverance to endure. We think that sport still reflects these same ideals and that sport still remains intertwined with these methods. Our athletes are respected with international renown, especially within rugby, and it supports the ideal that the New Zealand race is still as strong and enduring as ever. And through these values that we promote, it also combines elements of dependency for the country. Thirdly, we tell you that it embraces Māori ideals and culture. No, this isn't a direct response to the indigenous material that they brought out. Like, we think that sport celebrates the Māori identity, firstly with the inclusion of the haka, which is not tokenized, like the opposing team said to believe, because like the All Blacks have become a cultural symbol that embraces Māori heritage, reminds the population where we come from. It also means that like we encourage the same like strength of character and perspectives like that used to be a part of Māori identity. Like sport is a way of like intimidating other countries, and it's a good way to express this historic belief, not through like wars, but through like friendly competition. We shouldn't throw away sport so glibly when the Māori culture and language is dying so quickly in our country. We think sport invigorates people to like learn the haka and like to actually practice the national anthem, because when they see their favorite role model singing the national anthem, standing tall and proud, celebrating the Māori words in the first half of the song, when they see that on a global stage televised throughout the world, we think that sport is respected by the international community, and thus it allows them to embrace New Zealand's culture. So secondly, what is the impact that is spread to the fans through sport? A major implication of sport being a prominent part of our identity is that it will influence the youth. Yes.
Why shouldn't traits exclusive to New Zealand be the source of our national identity rather than a sport played in like dozens of other countries?
We think that like sports like rugby is actually a really exclusive thing to New Zealand. Like New Zealand was the one that popularized sports like rugby, and like and also like we put our own spin on sports, like through the inclusion of the haka during our rugby games that other countries do not do. So a major implication of sport is that it's a prominent part of our identity and that it influences the younger generation as well as the players in the industry itself. Firstly, it teaches them positive attributes in messaging. We tell you that sport teaches teamwork, the ability to work with others, embracing differences, accepting the other people in your team. It teaches leadership. It's like when you see sports teams and captains leading their team through the struggle, looking to like Richie McCaw, seeing how he keeps cool under pressure. He makes sure to check on every other member of his team. This supports inclusivity in society. It also teaches hard work and determination. Like when kids see the All Blacks lose the semi-finals in 2012, but they come back in 4 years in 2016 and they win the trophy, despite the media blaming them for every mistake, it shows that you can endure through hardship and persevere through any difficulties. Finally, it teaches you like ingenuity and resourcefulness. It proves to kids that New Zealand isn't a forgotten fringe nation in the world, that we are globally respected, and teaches kids to be proud of themselves, proud of their experiences in childhood, and proud of what New Zealand stands for. We spread these messages in two ways. Firstly, through positive role modeling, like when you look up to these All Blacks, like these favorite players, and you are replicating the ideals that you see expressed through the game. But secondly, like we think that sport being a part of the national identity encourages organizations and corporations to help encourage sport. This looks like Lotto deciding to donate the big majority of its funds towards subsidizing sport for low-income families because they know that it's so important to so many New Zealanders. And it looks like the Weet-Bix triathlon being such an important part of every kid's childhood each year. Things like that, like because everyone grew up loving these sports teams and like are supporting these local teams and clubs that have higher funding rates from a supportive government. It also means that like since sport is so physical, there's like a physical aspect, there's like a visual depiction of these ideals that kids can look up to, and therefore it's easier for them to relate to these things. At the end of this, we also encourage kids to be more physically active and actually like being outside and playing sport, which improves the health of our children and enables a better childhood. It also enables subsidization of sport through these organizations that I was talking about that allows poor families to also be a part of this. But really, it's about sport being involved in part of a national identity. Everyone in the country cheering for the same team, the entire country tuning in for the World Cup final. Ripping away sport now takes away the immense satisfaction and enjoyment that so many people gain out of the sport we are proud to propose.
Thanks, Travis. I now invite up the second affirmative speaker, Hugh, to continue his team's case.
New Zealand is known for many things overseas. We're known for our exemplary COVID response. We're known for our some commitments to our environment, and we are known for having a very unique Indigenous culture that absolutely needs preserving. Sports is not New Zealand because it was made overseas. It is not our sport. No sport is our sport. And therefore, making it the most prominent part of our culture only brings a plethora of harms such as tribalism and aggression and unnecessary competition in a world that does not need those, when there are parts of New Zealand culture that are desperately lacking and are not adequately prominent among our national identity. In my speech, I'm going to talk about how it's our moral obligation to uphold what we proposed as alternatives to be prominent in our culture, as they are unique to our islands and nowhere else, unlike sports. But first, I'm going to ask 3 questions regarding what's happened in the debate so far. No, 2 questions. First is, what does our current national identity look like? Are sports necessary to it? And what is the impact upon sports fans so far? On the first question of what does our current national identity work, what is it like? We heard the idea that it proves that we can punch above our weight. On our side of the house, we say that is not true. And no, thank you. It's not true in any particular way, but there are many ways New Zealand has made itself exemplary on the world stage. The opposition mentioned our performance in some of the world wars as our first chance, but even in a more recent example, with the COVID response, we're internationally renowned for that, and we've shown that despite being a small nation, there are many ways we can act exemplarily. You don't need to have a huge impact or win a competition to do anything. You need to act well as a nation. Again, the COVID example being an excellent way. We are by far the nation that's most ahead, and we have been given the most international respect for doing so. There was also the idea that sports brings passion for perseverance, and it is idolized, and it brings idolizations for athletes, and it brings a passion for sport. What we say is that we don't actually reject the idea of a passion for sports. No, thank you. We don't reject the idea of sports in general, but we say that people can have a passion for sports. However, it should not be part of the national identity. It should not be pushed on everyone, and it should not be part of what we consider ourselves as a nation. This is not about eliminating sports. Those who enjoy it are still able to go, but we regret that it's been relegating other parts of our national identity in favor of something like that. The final idea was that sports celebrate Maori culture. On our side of the house, we said that the haka is rather tokenistic and the overall Indigenous culture is largely relegated. So the opposition shot back, but overall, the haka is from one particular iwi, and there are actually iwi in the South Island who refuse to do that haka because of previous tribal disputes. And overall, embracing Maori culture, say as those who do in Ireland, by actually embracing the language or by embracing traditional cultural practices for the whole population is a lot better than a singular part of a sporting event. In no way is that actually fully representative, and it doesn't actually push it on the whole population who may not even necessarily understand it. I'll take that right now, actually.
New Zealand is the national champion in rugby and has characterized the game around our nation. When we are the only one who performs the haka and celebrates our country through our national anthem, is sport not unique to us?
I think rugby is absolutely not unique, and we were actually defeated in the last Rugby World Cup. So no, actually, it's not a prominent enough part of our identity, and nowhere are we representing Maori culture in the way we should. Even if we were getting it to a larger audience, it's still relegated to a very small part that is not fully Maori and not enough or adequate. Then on the second question, is what are the impacts upon fans? And our side of the house, we said there are a lot of negative impacts because of tribalism or because of just aggression or because of a needless amount of competition. The opposition said that it was a good outlet for anger in response to our material regarding domestic abuse. Well, the first thing is that absolutely not, because the anger we're talking about is largely coming from the fans, and this anger is directed towards band members, is directed towards friends, or it's just directed back into your life when you lose. If you take it to such serious, if you take it to such a serious level, and by being part of our national identity, it necessitates that it's therefore a massive part of everyone's psyche, and it's extremely important to them. And if you do that, it means it spills over into the rest of your life. This can just lead to general bad behavior around sports matches. You've got riots, you've got fights, you've got drunkenness, and you've got, as we said before, domestic abuse goes up after the All Blacks lose games, and this goes on a much smaller level as well, in a more of a disunifying way, because the opposition asked us to clarify in tribalism. What's tribalistic is people from individual sports clubs disliking each other or getting into fights over which team is better or whether a loss was legitimate or not. And we do have many smaller rugby clubs or many smaller clubs in different sports that's violence that's extremely unnecessary when you take it to that degree. There was the effect No, thank you. There's the idea that the effect on fans will give more accountability. As our first speaker said, we don't think the accountability is necessary if these, is the level of accountability is necessary if these players are not put to such a high regard and their opinions are held so highly just because they're sports players. Preventing the extreme acceptance of these opinions and broadcast is a lot better solution than simply holding them to account while they're at that level. They can still be held to account and also not be as prominent in our society. There was also the idea that teamwork is taught, that leadership is taught, that determination is taught. No, thank you. But we actually agree that these things are somewhat taught in sports. Once again, as I said before, it's not necessarily a removal of sports in our society. However, these things are also exemplified in the preservation of Indigenous culture or in the preservation of our environment. But more importantly, it's not like a zero-sum game. If you lose, you can't really lose at preserving the environment. It's a thing that all New Zealanders, no matter who you are or what you do, you can all contribute to that. It's far more of a positive role model, say someone who is an environmental preserver or promotes Indigenous language, because they're not harming anyone. It's not a zero-sum game. It's not a competition to hurt someone else or take away a victory from someone else. It's something that everyone can work towards. No, thank you. And more importantly, everyone can also enjoy in their own way. And yes, Lotto sponsors some sports, and they could sponsor environmental causes, and that would be wonderful, and everyone would win on doing that. Yes. On to my split point, which is it is a moral obligation to uphold our culture because it is our culture, it is our environment, and sports are ours. So the status quo is that a number of nations have made sports a massive part of their identity. You've got places like Australia or India, which take rugby and cricket to a very high line. And the bottom line is that sports is never has been and never will be exclusive to New Zealand. We did not invent any of them, and they were imported from overseas. What is distinctly New Zealand is our Māori culture, and is our natural environment that is found nowhere else. We have many indigenous species, and we have many parts of our environment that are seen nowhere else in the world. So therefore, on one level, it's most prominently based and exclusively in New Zealand. And we can actually all directly connect to it. We can all find pride in our environment. And actually, as Julie said, there are very real effects of the nature of our environment or Indigenous culture. And if those things aren't actually put to prominence, they're not preserved. Because it's unique, therefore, it's a moral obligation because only we actually have the ability to preserve them. And in many areas, such as with farming, there's been a lot of pushback for people actually taking steps to preserve very important parts of our environment, like our waterways. And with such great importance, if we were to take something like environmentalism or like Indigenous culture onto a full national stage, and it was like an ingrained part of national identity, it could, as Julie said, ascend partisanship. Like say in the United Kingdom, the NHS is fully a part of their government, and it's not a partisan issue between the parties. They're both dedicated to its preservation. If we could put, say, environmentalism or say Indigenous culture, something like preserving the Maori language or say the Zero Carbon Act or any kind of environmental legislation would transcend politics. It would be something that every party should be committed to supporting, and it is not a game of competition in the same way. So on our side of the house, we see that sports is fine. However, when it comes to something being prominent in our culture, we need it to be beneficial for everyone, and we need to actually have several more important things to be far more prominent. And we cannot allow sports to continue in that position with the great harms that it brings. Thank you.
Thanks, Hugh. I'd now like to invite up the second negative speaker of Waikato, Rob.
Sorry,
you're
have we
muted.
got the next speaker?
Sorry, I was muted. Can you hear me now?
Yeah, we can hear you.
Okay, cool. Mr. Speaker, the affirmative side of the House in today's debate fundamentally misunderstands the way that sport is acted about in society, fundamentally misunderstands how New Zealanders view sport and view the rest of their culture. In today's debate, we see that sport is not the be-all and end-all of our culture. It is not the only thing that we take pride in. It's not the only thing that we can be proud of. We are proud of our culture. We are proud of our heritage, and sport enables us, gives us a moral framework, gives us a set of values that help pursue those things, that help build those things, that help us value those things more in our society. 3 points for the House today. Firstly, what does our national identity look like in today's society? Secondly, what impact does that have on fans of the sport, have on society in general? And thirdly, I'll split and talk to you about how we encourage inclusivity, encourage the inclusion of all peoples within society through sport. But firstly, let's talk about what happens now. What does the national identity look like right now? What we brought you is that the national identity provides a way for New Zealanders to see ourselves as punching above our weight, for a way to see ourselves as a physical representation of what we should be striving for, as a physical representation of what we should be getting behind. What was the response from the opposing team? They said that it's not unique to us, that we should be valuing other things instead, that we should be valuing things like the environment, like the culture. Two responses here. Firstly, this sport is unique to us in that we make it our own. Through our ingenuity, through the way that we interpret it, we approach it, we make it part of our identity. Our identity historically and continues to be built on ingenuity, built on resourcefulness, built on determination. By incorporating those things into our sports, we make them our own. Secondly, culture, things like the environment aren't necessarily independent of all the other cultures, right? A lot of other countries have beauty, scenery, natural resources, all these things. Just saying that we also have them does not make them special to us. Just as we take ownership of our sports teams, we take ownership of the resources that we have. These two things are not similar. We do not have a unique responsibility to our environment. Secondly, on culture. We've already told you how Maori culture is celebrated through a variety of sports, how traditional Maori ideals and contemporary Maori ideals are able to be expressed in a positive way that is encouraging of debate and discussion of these things. What we also tell you here, what we heard in response is that it's tokenistic, that it's not representative of society, that it's not representative of Maori culture. But the fact is that people would not necessarily accept Maori culture as a part of New Zealand identity. They need something to get behind. They need something like a sports team, a tangible thing that will provide them the benefits. This is a similar issue arises with the environment, right? Just saying we would have the environment as our cultural focus isn't actually going to be effective in getting people convinced to take action. What we need is something real, something that's actually there, like the All Blacks, someone whose progress you can measure specifically, that the regular person can understand how it's going, whether they've won or lost. That sort of tangible thing is able to provide a sense of unity, is something that people can get behind and promotes the sense of culture that the affirmative team was so quick to dismiss. On this point of culture and of unity, we told you that it fosters friendly rivalry, that it's good to have an outlet for your expression of yourself, that clubs can get together and there's a sense of community. In response, we heard that there's tribalism, that other countries are seen as foes, that other groups are seen as foes. We see this is simply not true, right? What it is, in fact, is a community through which different people from different backgrounds, from different ideologies can come together under that single unifying idea of sport, that single unifying idea of skill, putting yourself out there on the sports field, doing your very best, and at the end of the day, being close to one another, being respectful of what the effort the other team put in, being respectful of their training, their commitment to and dedication to the sport. We think that this is beneficial for society as it increases on that. So that takes me to talking about how people react with sport, how sport influences how we see ourselves and how we see ourselves as a society. So on the topic of anger and domestic abuse, right? The issue brought by the affirmative team was that people get distraught because they're losing games. They're very angry, upset. They take it out on other people who don't deserve it. We had two responses. Firstly, that this isn't actually how New Zealanders act. As a people, we're very passive. We tend to be relatively positive about our sport. We just tend to move on past our defeats, look to the future, look to our successes. We're not as radical as many countries in Europe and areas like that where sport is taken a lot more aggressively. Secondly, it's good to have this outlet of emotion. It's good to have a sports field where you can express yourself, where that's accepted in society. We think that this diminishes and these harms to people increase when there isn't a way for people to let out how they're feeling in a safe, controlled environment. Lastly, on the messages brought about by sports people, the platform given to sports people through this things. We think that no matter what our identity is, there will always be people in power. There will always be people who have control. We think when there is an ability to hold these people to account, when there is an ability to say, as a member of this sports team who we support, you are not allowed to be saying that. That's not something that we can get behind. We're able to criticize those things much more effectively than what the opposing team would suggest, where you have just a few environmental leaders who aren't able to be held to the same account because they aren't representative of us in the same way. If there's a figurehead, we can criticize them. That isn't able to be done on their side of the house. Yes.
Won't we be able to rise these environmental leaders to the prominence that they'll be both accountable and effective?
Look, when environmental leaders are not the same as a sports team, right? People don't rally behind someone who is making environmental change in the same way that they rally behind someone who reflects the ideals of leadership, of physical determination, passion, those sorts of things. Those aren't reflected the same way in those sorts of environmental leaders who are making intangible change. We don't think that those people will be held to account as effectively. So lastly, let's talk about inclusivity. 2 points for the House today. Firstly, how we create opportunities for the less able. As a part of our national identity, we believe that it is every person's right, no matter their ability, to express themselves through sport. And as a result, we allow those who are feeling excluded opportunities that they wouldn't have otherwise. There's a reason why wheelchair basketball, wheelchair netball, these sorts of things, giving opportunities to these disadvantaged people is so prominent in our culture where it is not in others. As we respect sport, as we think sport is important, we provide opportunities to these people that they wouldn't otherwise get. We allow them to feel included. And secondly, it has low barriers of entry and it enables people from diverse backgrounds to mingle. As Travis has already talked to you about, there are government and school programs, things like Lotto, funding those from less opportunistic backgrounds to engage in sport. What this results is a mixing of kids from diverse backgrounds and a way for those kids to rise up above their situation, rise up above their circumstances. It doesn't matter how wealthy you are on the soccer field. It doesn't matter how wealthy you are on the rugby field. It provides an opportunity for you to show based on your individual skill. It creates leadership and culture we are very proud to negate.
Thanks, Rob. I now invite up the third affirmative speaker, Tony, to continue his team's case.
When sport is held as one of the most important, prominent parts of New Zealand society, it leads people to take it too seriously. This degrades to violence, tribalism, and ignoring more unifying national issues. We regret this. We regret that sports has risen to prominence over causes which have genuine social value, like environmentalism and Indigenous culture. These are values that we believe represent who we are as a country, not the sport that has been imported from England, from other countries. So 3 questions in this debate. Firstly, what does sports currently represent in New Zealand society? Secondly, what messages does it push onto us? And lastly, what is the effect? How does this stack up to alternative sources of national identities? So let's look at the first one. So what does it currently represent in New Zealand society? So we've heard from the opposition is that what this represents is our ability to stand up on the world stage. So firstly, we reject this on premise. So firstly, like we have risen to the world stage on many issues beyond like doing well in the World Cup. For example, firstly, going nuclear free in the 1980s was a major source of national pride for our country, and it was one that actually got a huge amount of international attention, significantly more so than winning like the 2011 Rugby World Cup. And more importantly, this is something that we took a genuine moral stand on. This is something that actually showed who we were as a country, because we were willing to make these sacrifices, like burning our bridges with like some of the most powerful countries in the world at that time to stand up for what we believe in. That is something that we are willing to stand by. What we aren't willing to stand by is just saying that winning a World Cup occupies the same level in our national identity. We believe that those are completely separate issues, so we don't believe that sports being such a big part of how we view ourselves internationally is positive or even necessarily true when you compare it to these much bigger and much more important issues. Another example would be our COVID response. We've received international acclaim for how we've responded to the outbreak of coronavirus, and this has been something that has given us a lot of positive attention. But again, it's something that like genuinely is important to everyone in New Zealand, and it's something that we're actually leading the world in. Other countries are modeling their response after us. And other countries have also begun to become more suspicious of great power diplomacy during the Cold War after we firmly stood up against the United States. These are things that we want to be leading the world on. We don't want this to be focused on the World Cup entirely. So what else does it represent? So we've also heard that this provides like a physical representation of what we are as a country. We reject this because our comparative is like also like physical representations of our country. Like for example, our natural environment is a physical representation. The culture and practice that we display are also physical representations. We don't see that sports is unique in this sense. But what we have heard is that sports is unique because so the position that sports takes up in our national consciousness is one that actually means that it takes away from other issues, because there is just a limited amount that people can think about at one time. There is a limited amount to what can constitute as a core tenet of our national identity. And by removing sports off this pedestal, we actually free up space for other much more deserving causes. But what is important to note is that we do not stand for like banning sports. Like we don't have any issue with people playing sports or enjoying sports. What we stand for is removing sports from its pedestal as something that is ingrained as part of our identity. So secondly, what messages does sports push on us? So what we've heard from the opposition is that this pushes values of teamwork and leadership. Firstly, that is incredibly vague because like, again, we reject this on premise because like people can still play sports. So they still learn these values firsthand. We don't believe that these values stem from like, all this like immense amount of pride of like the All Blacks compared to just being like getting that practical experience of actually being in team. But like furthermore, it isn't like even if like sports just ceases to be a source of like learning about teamwork, like there's still other ways to do that. Like sports is simply not unique in that there are like almost anything you do in the real world involves teamwork, involves some level of leadership. We believe that there are so many different ways that people also learn these skills, that even if sports were completely cut out as a mechanism for learning that, which we also reject, and like even then people still know how to work in a team. People still know like how leadership works. It's not an exclusive benefit. Secondly, what we've told you is this actually promotes values of tribalism and nationalism. So why is this? Because culturally we are taught to identify with our country beyond anything else. We always back New Zealand in the Olympics. We always back the All Blacks in the game. We never can, like, that's fine in a sports game, but when it goes beyond that into other issues, we should not just identify with our country no matter what happens. We need to be willing to critically analyze the country and being willing to like criticize our own team. That is something that just doesn't happen in sports. Yeah.
When kids play sport, they are involved in the real physical sense of actually being like present in the game. Do they not learn more when they're engaged in this experience, and do they not have better leadership qualities as a result?
Well, like the kids are still going to play games. We don't see that as play like sports. We don't see that as any different. Like, there are a lot of things kids do which aren't part of our national identity, which they still, take lessons on. Like I'm probably learning quite a bit about teamwork right now, and debating isn't part of New Zealand's national identity in any way, shape or form whatsoever. So whether or not it's a part of our national identity is completely removed to whether or not people can extract value from participating into it. So second, to make my point, so fundamentally what it teaches is that sports is a zero-sum game. It teaches people to identify with New Zealand, to identify with our country, and view the international game as one of competition rather than one of cooperation, which is an issue because a lot of the most pressing issues we are facing, like climate change, are issues which transcend borders. They are issues that need cooperation, not competition. And by pushing values of competition between countries onto our people, that is something that is inherently harmful. That is the tangible harm we can get from this. And we also see the other thing we also see is this like immense emotional harm when like people are so emotionally invested into these games, because like, sometimes you have to lose some games, right? And we reject the like assertion from the other team that domestic violence and violence just doesn't occur after like losing All Blacks matches. That is something that is well documented, and that is actually quite well, yeah, that is like well seen in like New Zealand society. That is a thing that is important, and that is something that is like genuinely really harmful to a lot of people. We reject the like assertion that it just doesn't exist. So onto the last point of clash. So what is the effect of this? And thank you. What is the effect on other sources of culture? So when we focus on sports matches, this comes at the expense, like I said in the intro, this comes at the expense of other values and principles. So the ones that we've talked about the most throughout this debate is that of the environment and culture. So what we've heard as a response is that we simply cannot get people to rally behind those causes in the same way as we can get people to rally behind sports. We reject that completely. If we look at the example of like looking at our like indigenous culture, we can look at the example of Ireland. Ireland, because of their government in the past, has very strongly pushed the idea of like maintaining the Gaelic identity. Now, modern day Ireland, there is a lot of pride in their indigenous culture. A lot of people learn how to speak Gaelic. Well, very few people in New Zealand can speak Te Reo. A lot of people are really proud of who they are in Ireland, not because of any sport, but because of their culture, because of who they are and where they came from. The other alternative that has come under contention is that of the environment, but we also reject the fact that people can't rally behind the environment, like because again, the environment is such an emotional issue for so many people. Like we have seen examples throughout the past and even quite recently of people literally rallying behind the environment. There is a tangible, I think that's out of time. There are tangible examples of people rallying behind these causes, and ultimately they're both significantly more valuable in sports because if they succeed, they actually get significantly more wide-reaching tangible harms. Like if we can promote like indigenous culture, we can provide a better sense of identity and a better sense of belonging to many marginalized groups. And if we can promote better care of the environment, then we actually get a better environment to live in and better outcomes in that sense as well, which is why we are very proud to support a country where we believe that we are proud to affirm.
Thanks, Tony. I'd now like to invite up the third negative speaker of Waikato, Andrew.
When you go to a foreign country and ask people what they think of New Zealand, there's a good chance they'll talk about a famous New Zealand sports team. When you ask a child at a local primary school what inspired them to train and work hard on their school rugby team, there's a good chance they'll mention the All Blacks. The national culture of sports is directly the thing that helps these achievements and inspires these efforts. Throughout this debate, side negating was the only side that saw this identity for what it was worth and defended the benefits it brings. When side affirming tells you that these things detract from New Zealand's other elements and fails to realize why sport has been so beneficial, so important in New Zealand society, they lose today's debate. Two main points of clash I bring you in my speech. Firstly, on whether sports are inherently good and beneficial, and secondly, on the efficacy of alternatives. Firstly, we're going to talk about whether sports are inherently good and beneficial. This is obviously incredibly important in this debate because we obviously obviously sports being part of our national identity, we need to prove that sports are actually good. We told you down the line that the presence of sports in our national identity was good, that it fostered outreach, it fostered community and cooperation, and that is all good. Side affirming had a few major contentions here. Let's go through them. Firstly, they told us that sports are very competitive. That can affect people's moods and make them angry. Firstly, we told you already that these mood swings are largely temporary. They're not incredibly severe mood swings at the point that they're going to make people like so angry at the point that they go home and then beat up their wives. We tell you that's not like a major problem in this debate. That's not something that loads of people go and do, especially in New Zealand, which is a relatively mild culture. We're not like Italy or other countries where like sports culture is inherently very violent. New Zealand is generally quite proud of our like relative kindness and our accepting of one another. That extends further to sports. Secondly, we tell you that many of these many of the harms they pose on their side of the house are generally quite illegal. New Zealanders, being a very rather intelligent culture, are the type of people that aren't going to engage in things like riots on the streets after losing a sports game. That's not happened before, and it's never going to happen. We don't see that risk being something that's actually going to occur. Let's look at some more. What else did they tell us? They told us that sports will make people see other countries as foes. Well, sure, technically that's true, but that's generally a friendly rivalry. The vast majority of people don't hate other countries outside of sport because of sport. People might not like other countries because of their like economic impacts, because of their like attitudes towards wars, etc. But they're not going to hate another country because their sporting team beat us once. That's not something that often happens. It doesn't go beyond this into other issues as they would proclaim, because generally people recognize the fact that sports teams are overall just a game, and that it's overall just something that like that's like for fun. Okay, then they told us that like sports might make people tribalistic, that it starts fights, riots, etc. Again, we told you it's quite rare in NZ, but secondly, we tell you that all rivalries between sports teams are generally friendly rivalries. For example, there's competition between local teams in New Zealand, such as competitions between the Chiefs and the Warriors, etc. There's local teams, but they all band together behind the All Blacks. What does this tell you? This tells you that the majority of like sports rivalries are generally quite arbitrary at the point that people are willing to give them up to band together against in favor of a greater sports team. At the point that all of this occurs, we tell you that the like culture of sports in New Zealand generally respects team rivalries and inter-country rivalries as mostly like a friendly rivalry and not something that's worth getting up in arms and starting riots about. Lastly, they told us on this that people might idolize like harmful sports people. Look, let's be crystal clear here. For every slightly bad sports person, there's 20 people who are very good. There's 20 people who foster incredible community relationships and are great role models for younger kids. Secondly, we tell you that more famous people, especially at the point where sports are a national identity, are held more accountable at the point it's a national identity. We told you many benefits of our sports on our side, such as community, etc. And it was not good enough for side affirming to merely say that people can like still play sport without it being a national identity, that we still get these benefits without it being a national identity. Sports being part of our national identity is what makes people do it. It's what makes kids join sport at the point that it's so popular. All of the benefits we get on our side of the house are actually exclusive to our side of the house at the point where it's a national identity. It is so popular. Second, we're going to move on to the second point of clash on the efficacy of alternatives. This is important in today's debate because a lot of the stuff about environment and moral culture is what side affirming wanted to win on. We were very clear on our side of the house that alternatives in sports were not mutually exclusive, but rather mutually beneficial. Side affirmative wanted a world where multicultural and environment was part of our image, and that the main thing they had here is that there wasn't enough like just one thing in national identity. We tell you that it's just not true that with the presence of sport in our national identity, people just don't know anything about culture and environment. Like, firstly, people do associate New Zealand with multiple things. Like, someone might say All Blacks at first when asked about NZ, but then, like you said, they'll talk about Jacinda Ardern, they'll talk about our multiculture, they'll talk about our COVID response, etc. But the thing is, sports enhances that identity. Sports allows for that identity to become more widespread and nuanced. For example, our environment is advertised by things such as Tourism NZ, who link it to sport and have advertisement displaying sport in New Zealand's natural environment to link the two things together and help foster our national identity as one that includes all of these elements and not just a single one. That makes it more appealing. That makes New Zealand as a whole more appealing. I'll take a POI.
If we could actually elevate a particular issue that isn't sports to non-partisan level into the highest level of national consciousness, would that have more of an impact upon the issue than having it relegated by sports?
Well, firstly, you're making it suggest that issues such as the environment, like our natural landscape and multicultural are like partisan issues. I'm pretty sure there's no party in New Zealand that thinks we don't care about like multi people. We don't think that's really that like important. We don't really understand the premise of that point. Okay, right. Let's move on then to like some of the other like claims they made on this point. Like for example, like only the haka gets airtime, and that other indigenous groups don't get enough airtime in the status quo. We tell you that like community sports do help foster many of these things, and that like ultimately with the presence of sports in our national identity, they are the things that actually enable these views to come out and actually be known, especially at the point where community sports teams can help spread these identities to other areas. At the point where sports is not part of our national culture, at the point where that's not something New Zealanders are doing, we don't get any of those benefits. They also told us that, for example, there may be other means that allow New Zealand to punch above our own weight. For example, our COVID response. Like, yeah, sure, but that doesn't mean sports are irrelevant at the point they help spread other ideas. What this comes down to is that like cultures such as Māori are like dying cultures currently, and the fact that we're tying it into sports helps make it more known. It helps make it helps like the fact that the haka is played on like global television during the World Cup. That's something that is incredibly helped by that's something that incredibly helps multiculture at the point that it's actually tied into sport. It's actually tied into something that a lot of people understand. That's something that will never happen at all on their side of the house. That's something that never happens when sports isn't part of our national identity at all. Last, we're going to talk about when they said that sports are not like inherently New Zealand. Look, sure, the initial concept of sport isn't NZ made, but as we've told you many times, we have our own twists on this. Even if it's not original to New Zealand, at the point where a vast majority of New Zealand are identifying with, are good at and enjoying it, it should be part of our national identity. At the end of this debate, what do we see? On our side of the house, we see sports massively helping not only New Zealand communities and culture, but also all the alternatives that they wanted to talk about on their side of the house. We're very, very proud to negate. This way.
Thanks, Andrew. I'd like to invite the negative team back up for their reply. So welcome to Travis.
Identity has to be something everyone in the country is passionate about and believes in. Sport unifies the country around positive community ideals. An 8-year-old kid is engaged as he plays local rugby. He feels a part of his country. That same 8-year-old kid is not going to advocate for corporate responsibility or see the same levels of interest in promoting heritage. There are 2 points of clash. Firstly, which alternative best represents New Zealand's identity that people can get behind? Secondly, what are the impact on the fans if this becomes the national identity that we support? So firstly, which alternative is best? We told you that sport provides a sense of unity and culture, as every member in New Zealand can feel like they're all watching the same Rugby World Cup final and they're all embracing the determination and resourcefulness of their people. They brought out 2 alternatives. Firstly, Māori cultural and heritage. We told you that sport also celebrates Māori culture and heritage. It's not tokenistic, as we celebrate the haka that does represent every region, but we also celebrate singing the national anthem on a global televised stage. And when you see your positive role model standing tall and proud, singing that national anthem, you're going to be more likely to feel proud of your country. We also told you that we embrace Māori ideals like intimidating the enemy, and sport reflects Māori heritage. The second alternative the opposing team brought us was the environment. Firstly, we told you that the environment is not unique to New Zealand. Other countries also have beautiful scenery. Secondly, we told you that lots of other countries are also pursuing environmental change. And thirdly, we said that identity needs to be about your personal values. It's about the people in the country, and it doesn't represent ideals and like changing personality traits like determination and leadership that sport does. It's only about corporations. We shouldn't make our identity something that does not represent individuals. Finally, they said there were other ways to differentiate New Zealand, such as through COVID. We say that like sport couples the examples and enhances the global effect of this, but also that global responses like this COVID-19 that are widely televised were only enabled by the persona that we are powerful and punching above our weight, which sport created in the first place. Without sport, these responses would not have been as effective. We told you that the unique aspect of sport is to be televised throughout the international community, and that since sport is embraced in other countries, rather than like other more controversial issues, there's a unique contrast in sport for other countries embracing us. In terms of tribalism, we said that firstly it won't happen because we think that New Zealand's quite an inclusive, friendly place, and that there were no mechanisms to, and our mechanisms for social inclusivity reduces tribalism, but like secondly, that they know it's just a game and that it's just like a friendly competition, and that like Chiefs and Crusaders can play against each other, but everyone will still support the All Blacks overall in the end. So what is the impact of embracing sport as a national identity on like the kids themselves? We told you that it encourages physical activity, then like environmental reform and Māori heritage doesn't actually change the ways that citizens and the people act. We told you that it encourages good messages. There were a few responses to this. They said that like idolization is bad. We told you this is not true because when these leaders spread harmful messaging, there's likely going to be social backlash because they are a public figurehead and such a prominent part of our identity. And Israel Folau is only like one bad model, and there are 20 other good people that kids can look up to. Like kids can look up to Aaron Cruden instead of Israel Folau, and like we think that they have good alternatives that do spread good messages like leadership, endurance, integrity, and determination. In response to the domestic anger and drinking points, we had a couple reasons why this wouldn't happen. Firstly, we said that the mood swings were not true, and that like you don't last for a couple months. Your sadness usually only lasts for a week, and it's not going to incentivize riots in the street or beating your kids and family. We also said that we provide an outlet for anger in the controlled, regulated environment of the sporting industry. Finally, we told you that like the sporting industry becomes an inclusive place where every kid can feel like their team is a new family to them, and local clubs and organizations will back this. We involve the youth, and that they are passionate about the issue that the identity is embracing. Proud to propose.
Thanks, Travis. I now invite up the leader of Wellington Black, Julia.
Okay, we all good to begin? Okay. New Zealand is among one of the worst countries in the world with a record of domestic abuse. I just want to say that from the start, because Neg's case has been full of contradictions. They've told us that New Zealanders are passive people who like don't domestically abuse. They also told us that like people are rallied for war around sport in their first speech. They said that people support Māori culture through sport, but also that they'll never support it as a national identity. They've also misunderstood our whole case, because we're not here to ban sports altogether. We agree, like it does have value in society. We just don't want it to be a cornerstone of our national identity for all the reasons we've laid out throughout our case. With that in mind, 2 questions in this debate. Firstly, what are the messages that sport as part of our national identity is pushing upon our people, and why are they harmful? And secondly, why is the comparative preferable? So on to the first question about the messages that sport pushes on our society when it is part of our national identity and why they are harmful. We have told you that sport, people get so involved with it, they get pent up and they start taking out their anger out on families. As a response, we've been told that like sport is just an outlet for anger and it's just not an issue, doesn't happen. But like tell that to the domestic abuse record, which you have so clearly ignored. You can't just say it's not an issue. That is objectively not true. Okay, we've also told you that you get tribalism and fighting between different regions of New Zealand because they're like taught to hate each other because they're always facing off against each other. They're seen as foes. I told you there is, for the same reason, like opposition to internationalism and also idolization of people who potentially are pushing problematic views upon the public. We say even if there's only a couple of them, they're still pushing those views when they wouldn't otherwise be. So that is bad. Okay, so what does NEG said in response? They say that it's like good to have people to look up to learn leadership. We say we still have sports, people can still learn these things, but like even if we get rid of all sport, which is obviously not our case, but like even if there are other ways to achieve proficiency in leadership and have people to look up to, but it's not an exclusive benefit. So for example, debating, but like there's so many different things like protest movement, social change that young people can get involved in, etc. Like learning leadership is absolutely not exclusive to sport. We absolutely reject that premise. We've also proved, they've told us that we can like prove that we punch against our weight as a country. We think there are so many other ways, once again, to show this, including our COVID response or our nuclear-free work in the 60s, the 80s. Also, so important and shown that New Zealand can take a place on a world stage, absolutely not tied solely to our sport identity. So we've proven that like sport doesn't actually have a net positive benefit on our society when it is harming our communities and harming our ways of viewing each other, and instead providing no like positive benefit that it cannot be fulfilled by other things. So what is the comparative and why is it better? We've told you that like national identity, when things are part of the national identity, they're like a non-partisan issue that everyone can get behind. We also say that it's mutually exclusive between sports and these other like environment and Māori issues, because there is a limit to how much can be held on a pedestal by a country. Okay, so what did we tell you? We said that when we prioritize environment as part of a national identity, we get a better environment because people care more about it than we're likely to vote in favour. It becomes a non-partisan policy that everyone is getting behind. And we like can't lose at protecting the environment. So it's obviously something really easy to get behind. And we say like, yes, we want to protect New Zealand uniquely because it has all these unique features like the kiwi, right? There's unique biodiversity that we have. We say that everyone can get behind it as opposed to sport, which some people just don't care about. You know, it's far more of a rallying factor in sport. And we also say that we can have a greater impetus on Māori culture, which is great because people like can properly understand it, not tokenize it. And basically the exact fact that side NEG thinks that Māori culture is just like intimidation and haka shows that Māori culture has been tokenized by sport. We want to reverse that by making it something that we can all care about. And we do that by making it part of our national identity. So we can accomplish actual change as it compared to sport, which is like arbitrary and has no social benefit and so many harms. Okay, so we also, yeah. So with all of that in mind, we achieve like better cultural values for Māori people, we improve our environment, and we don't sacrifice any things in terms of leadership because sport is not the only way to achieve leadership skills.
Thanks, Julia, and thanks both teams for the debate. So I'll end the live stream now.